Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Kvetching with Adam and Jarrod. We recorded just one yesterday evening. I was sure to change my shirt and not put on the one I was wearing tomorrow, so people might think, I don't wear the same clothes over and over again. And as usual, we will, of course, let our guest introduce himself. You go by he, right? I'm just, making sure.
Uh,
But I would
yes,
like to say a few words before we do that,
In a
though.
second, hold on, I'm not finished
All
yet.
right.
Yeah, I just want to point out that although it might say Stephen Reich, and he's not the third Reich in his family, I've checked that. He's Jewish, so his yichus wouldn't be three generations of Stevens. He actually pronounces it Reich, not Reich, but he will correct us on that. He is also another Canadian, just like we had on for our previous episode, though he is not from Montreal. So I'm still
no.
stacking the deck with Canadians. He is unfortunately from Winnipeg, or I should say he's from the unfortunate city of Winnipeg, which is somewhere above North Dakota or Montana. And I had the misfortune of driving through it once. And when my friend and I stopped on a Sunday evening to think if we should spend the night, and we asked somebody at a 7-Eleven or whatever they're called in that part of Canada, is there anything to do here in Winnipeg? And she said, where are you going? We said, Vancouver. She said, just get in your car and keep going. Don't turn around. There's nothing to see. There's nothing to look at. Just get out of here. And yeah, you could sit there and watch your dog run away for 3 days on your front porch if you want to. But I'm sure the town has other things going for it. I will let Adam say his word now, though I will point out, though I did Adam a favor here, and Stephen noted it as I was fixing my hair before we broadcast, that I am also stacking the deck with two people without hair. So, this way I am in the minority on some fashion for today's episode.
But I have a little bit more hair than Steven does, though.
You don't know what's going on in the back of his head, Adam. You can't say that for certain.
Oh, all right.
Yeah,
Well,
there's not really.
Yeah. And
well,
he's got
Not much
that
going on.
well-groomed beard, okay? So when you pull
but
that
which
off.
of us have more hair than the psychoanalyst that called me a liar, liar, hair on fire?
Liar, liar, hair on fire on Mira's wall. I think Stephen was present for that discussion. Yeah.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, he must have been.
I
Oh, I
was.
didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I just want to say that before we started broadcasting, before we started recording, these guys were giving me a hard time about the camera being dark, right? And I guess this is happening a lot on our episodes. I want to reveal why that is happening. My real name is actually Lamont Cranston. I am the shadow.
Okay.
I know what evil lurks in the hearts of men.
I know that's a reference to like a 1950s or 60s TV show with Adam is the expert.
Radio show.
Oh, okay, I'm going even further back. Okay.
Yeah.
Before the invention of television.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I want to add that this is great because those of you, probably some of you in the audience that have been fans of Rush Limbaugh years ago before he died.
Well, we have Rush Limbaugh fans in our viewership. Right. Okay. Anyways,
There might be some Limbaugh fans out there. I don't know, but I've always wanted to say Robert Reich's name exactly like Limbaugh says Robert Reich's name. So I'm going to say right now that we have with us a guest. We have Stephen Reich.
Well, that's not how he pronounces it. He's going to correct that in a minute. Yeah. He's not Reich or he's not Reich. We'll get it right. We'll get it right the third time.
Right, but I didn't go as long on that as Limbaugh does. Like he hyperventilites with that song.
Well, fortunately, I have not watched Rush
True.
Limbaugh for more than a minute and a half ever.
It's a radio show, Jarrod. Do you know the difference between radio and television?
I'm not sure you do, since you just referenced The Shadow, which you probably listened to out of one of your antique telephones that's still broadcasting it.
All right.
Anyways, let's turn it over to our guest, who will correct all pronunciations of his name and justify his Winnipeg origins, if you will.
I will. Well, I have to say, I mean, it is a small city, but it produces great people, and it's got an amazing Jewish community that produces a lot of culture and a lot of great thinkers. So I am going to give a shout out to Winnipeg for that sense. Granted, not beautiful like Montreal.
Or Youngstown. Let's not forget Youngstown.
Or Youngstown. I think I've driven through Youngstown.
Which city has more potholes, Winnipeg or Youngstown?
Oh, Montreal wins on the potholes across the board. Everybody.
Yeah, I think Montreal
Oh,
probably.
Oh.
Although Winnipeg's pretty bad. I mean, the freezing
Youngstown
and
is the worst of all with the potholes.
I don't know.
Montreal, no, the snow gets terrible. They don't fix it in the spring. It's a disaster. Yeah, they don't really.
Youngstown's solution to the pothole problem is to just put an orange cone out there and leave it
Mm.
there for a couple of years.
Well,
That's
Montrealers run over the orange cone, so that doesn't work for us.
Anyway, well, Winnipeg's flat, so eventually, it all sort of settles and, people make do. But I haven't lived there for a long time. Although I go back at least once a year.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, now that we've cleared that up, first of all, did you mention your name is
Yes,
pronounced Reich and not Reich?
Riche,
Okay.
yes,
So it's Stephen Reich.
yes, and you can really
All
give
right.
the
Yeah.
emphasis on the sh. Sure.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Now tell us about why we have you as our guest today.
Yeah, well, good question. You probably have me as your guest
Yeah.
because I'm researching critical theory in education, and so I become a bit of a mumche on the issue of what critical theory is, DEI, how it has colonized education and really made a mess of things, and now, of course, since October 7th, I've been in a little bit of demand talking about how critical theory and DEI is also making a mess of being a Jew in the diaspora.
Hey, could you tell us what curriculum studies is?
Well, I would hope that curriculum studies was actually about the subject matter that is supposed to be in the curriculum. And, it's about how you stage it from grade 12 backward. I would hope that it's that, but it tends to be more about, social justice and racial and gender identities and how we have to dismantle everything so that we can overthrow society and reach some sort of social justice utopia.
That's
Whatever,
curriculum studies. What does that have to do with curricula?
not much.
Yeah.
Well, that becomes the curriculum. Then the
Oh,
curriculum is that.
okay. All right. Because Jarrod and I were looking at a some rabid anti-Zionist who was had a PhD in curriculum studies, and I had absolutely no idea what that is. I've never heard of it.
Invite him on our show. We'll figure it out. I don't
Yeah,
remember who it
yeah,
was.
yeah.
Mhm.
No, so that would be, they would be very interested in making, rather than kids learning about world history or learning geography or reading novels, that, the kids would then attend a struggle session around Jewish, what Jewish history means and Zionism. And of course, what the conclusion is and what all the kids under that curriculum would have to conclude, which is that, Zionism is white supremacy and must be wiped from the earth. So
Sounds like the
I would
Soviet Union
imagine
to
that's
me.
probably.
Yeah.
All right. So I just hope that not very much government subsidy goes towards this particular discipline, but whatever.
Canada or the United States? I suspect
Either
Canada's in a
one.
bad position. Well, so Stephen's going to talk to us about his work because I have found that whenever I try to have a sensible discussion with people on the left, and I start using terms like critical theory, critical race theory, intersectionality, woke, especially, that term's considered to be derogatory at this point. When I try to
They came up
explain.
with it. It was their term.
It was, I know, I think it's fine. But when I try to explain what I mean by that and the binary of oppressor versus victim and all that stuff and how it inherently, puts the Jews into a box. I don't know if it's inherent, but at least the way they've structured it, it puts the Jews into a box. I start getting to be, I start getting called a shill for Fox News and whatever else. So we have brought on an expert today, someone who is doing just completed their master's degree with a very well-received thesis on the topic and is now doing their PhD on the subject. And I wrote a fascinating article about them. And my only criticism was that he used the word which twice in the abstract, rather it should have been that.
Right.
Someone drilled that into my head my first semester of my PhD, and I've tried my best not to make that mistake ever
The
since.
correction has already been made.
Oh, that's great. So you found the two instances. All right, terrific. Okay, so Stephen, please tell us about what all this stuff means and why, and then we'll get into why it's actually a problem if people can't deduce this for themselves. We'll leave the Jews out of it at first because we really need to understand what critical theory is. And I'm not 100% sure I know what critical theory is. I'm curious what its relationship is to the Frankfurt School because they get bashed all the time on Fox News, and people say, "Oh, they're being anti-Semitic. They're talking about cultural Marxism." You know, whether cultural Marxism is even an
Does
actual
Fox
thing.
News ever bash the Frankfurt School?
They bash cultural Marxism, which is associated with the Frankfurt School, and I know it's a bit of a leap, but there is a connection there. So
Yeah,
but it might have some validity. So I want to get to the bottom of this.
sure. And feel free to interrupt me and ask questions and
Oh,
whatever
Jarrod,
as
sure.
I was about to say Adam's going to say I always interrupt. So, but
no problem,
you beat
no
me to it
problem.
this time.
I
So
couldn't edgewise with Barbara Kay yesterday.
What you just interrupted him? What did you say?
I said I couldn't get a word in edgewise with Barbara Kay yesterday.
Not because of me. It had nothing to do with me. She was
Both of
talking.
you. So
Oh, okay.
anyway,
Well,
whatever. Stephen, it's
you
your
listen, it's
dominated
hard.
you dominated the conversation about Canada actually at the beginning. I didn't say a word about Canadian politics.
All right.
All right.
Whatever.
And you have three Jews in a room. That's going to be noisy. You have to fight for your
Yeah.
space. That's
Yeah.
just the way it is. Okay, so critical theory. So first, I want to say I use the term critical theory. There are lots. People are struggling to find the word. You're right. Oftentimes, people use the word wokeism. I prefer not to because I want to be able to have a conversation with people who are believe in critical theory almost religiously, and for them to hear it. And if I say woke, they're not going to listen. Like right there and then, oh, that's racist. It's cultural appropriation. This came from the black movement at the time of civil rights in the United States. So I prefer not to use the term woke. I use critical theory because it's present in the terms like critical race theory, critical gender theory. So I think that makes sense, and it does have its genesis is with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theorists, who were a group of very wealthy Jews in the 1920s Weimar Germany, who were funded by their parents' grain business in Argentina, and they wanted to they were philosophers who were trying to understand why the socialist revolution didn't happen in the industrial West.
Hold on,
And
they were all in the grain business.
no, there was one in particular. I think it was Habermas's father who was in the grain business, and he had made a lot of money. And basically, his son had a stipend, and he was using the money to fund the Frankfurt School. But they
Habermas is
were
considered part of the Frankfurt School. Like,
yes,
I always think Adorno, Marcuse,
yep, also
yeah,
Adorno, yeah,
yeah.
all of them. So they were first of all they were fascinated by Jewish thinkers. So Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and what they were trying to come up with was they loved Sigmund Freud's whole ideas around the subconscious, and they thought that maybe this worked with Marxism in terms of the lack of consciousness in workers. They saw themselves as akin to the oppressed workers because they were oppressed by varying levels of anti-Semitism, which of course only grew once the Nazis looked like they were coming into power. And basically they were still materialists, so they were really focused on the workers, but again, they were very instrumental in saying, there's the oppressors who are the capitalists, and then there's the oppressed who are the workers. And, the workers have to develop their consciousness to understand that they're part of a system so that they can overthrow it for some sort of utopia. And it was, they were not interested in actually changing society. They were just interested in critiquing society. That's pretty much, where they started. Of course, the rise of the Nazis, they all decamped mostly ultimately to the United States. And then there was the influence on the critical theorists of the postmodernists, the post-structuralists. So suddenly they became very interested in language. So as if changing words, using new terms, new definitions was going to make a big difference in being able to critique society and have that critique resonate with everybody else. Now, because they're in the United States, and at a time, where there was systemic discrimination against African Americans because of Jim Crow, this then became something that was taken up not so much by the the universalists like Martin Luther King Jr., who saw equality as a matter of, he was a universalist, he was a Christian. The idea that all men are born equal, and therefore we have to see people as the creation of God, not their external appearances. He was not that interested in race, except in calling the Black Americans a race. But his dream, as we all know, is that people would be judged by their character and their thoughts and ideas, and not by their skin color. Of course, at the same time, you have this other movement of Black separatists who are saying it's all about race, and basically, we want to create a society where we actually have like a separate society. We don't think we can ever live with the out group, who from a Black American perspective, you're Black, which is the in group, or you're white, which is the out group. And I often try to explain that to people and saying, like, when you're Jewish, the in group is you're a Jew, the out group is you're either a goy or a non-Jew. But what I find interesting in currently is that when we are, and we're going to get back to this, but when we are asked as Jews, that you're supposed to be white, I always say, well, I don't insist that non-Jews self-identify as goy, right? That may be, every in-group has a term for the out-group.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, I mean, just because they're entitled to do that, that's their group. I'm not going to tell them what to do. In the same way, I wouldn't want someone to come to the Jewish community and say, these are the terminologies that you have to use. But in any event, with the student revolutions in Germany, particularly Marcuse, this is where he became instrumental. Now
was he Jewish too?
He was Jewish also.
I know most of them were.
They almost all of them.
Horkheimer was Jewish too.
Horkheimer was Jewish.
I don't
Adorno
think
was Jewish.
Adorno wasn't.
He
No,
was.
Adorno was.
He was half.
Oh, he was.
Yeah, Adorno was Jewish.
Yeah. I went to Berkeley. There was a big cult of the Frankfurt School there that followed Martin Jay, who was one of the leading experts.
Yeah. So basically, Marcuse, he really sort of rose to fame within the Frankfurt School during the student protests in Germany when he went out and he decided, already there was the move to replace workers with Black people. And that came from the United States. And so he wanted to, now, of course, that is not going to have the same resonance in Europe. So he replaced the oppressed workers with the oppressed students and promising them sexual freedom. And he became like a big superstar because of that.
Late 60s?
Late 60s, 1968.
Did he appear at Woodstock to advocate these views?
I don't know if I don't. Something tells me he wasn't. He would have been, probably aged out of Woodstock, but certainly he became. I mean, he really ate it up. Like he loved the attention that he was getting, and so that was very powerful. I mean, what student would not want to hear? We should follow this. We need to overthrow the system so we can have sexual liberation. And of course, it was the same time that the decolonization, the actual decolonization movements around the world, the independence of countries throughout Asia and Africa, so again, all of this was like the noble fighter, the Frantz Fanon. We're gonna purify our souls with blood. These are very exciting ideas to 20-year-olds who are pumped full of 20-year-old hormones. And so he became very famous for this. Now, what was going on then in the States after that is you had Black scholars who were interested in Black studies that now adopted basically the model of critical theory, the oppressors and the oppressed, and they substituted again, from workers to students to now African Americans, and then constructed the whole thing in terms of intersectionality. And of course, that was, a legal theory that Kimberly Crenshaw came up with, and based on, precedents in the United States Supreme Court that you had to choose one mode of discrimination, and then you couldn't argue others. And I should note for our Canadian viewers that the Canadian Constitution has never restricted anyone to one. It's all contextual. But this became a legal theory, and then suddenly we went from a legal theory to it became a sociological theory. that, everybody is on the oppression ladder, and, depending on your race, and at that time your sexuality, less about gender identity, that came later. But then you had someone like Judith Butler coming, again, using the same model and talking about gender, and gender is performance. So now suddenly we're separating gender from biological sex, and because everything in critical theory assumes that there is no objective reality, that science is a myth, and that biology is irrelevant, that we are all born blank slates, and that, it's that Marxist model that, just give me the youngest child that you can, and I'm going to turn them into the ideal human that is going to inhabit this new utopia that we have.
But hang on,
I mean,
that's the foundational premise of even the Enlightenment, right? I mean, that we are blank slates, and education is what makes us. So this should lead to a universalist theory, near as I can tell, where everyone can be the same and a person can be a person. At least that's what they set out to do originally.
well, I think, it certainly, the Enlightenment principles led to also Marxism and neo-Marxism, and of course, I mean, there's many branches. But I think that what the Enlightenment did, because of its love of science, is that we began to realize that there is an objective reality somewhere out there. The point of science is to try and get as close as possible to understanding, within our limitations, what that objective reality is. And we do that through continued observation, replication of observations, and so that we can formulate a model of what we think reality looks like. Of course, depending on new findings or whatever, then that changes over time. I mean, I think that the critical theorists sort of make a mockery of science. They say, that science claims that it's objective truth when science does no such thing, because they really, really they want that blank slate. They want to believe that there is no such thing as reality, no such thing as biology, that science is just another myth or ideology.
But they go beyond that. They will say that mathematics is a tool of white supremacy, for instance.
Yeah, right. Because in their view, and again, like, it's ahistorical, right? Critical theorists are not interested. Well, there are a few exceptions. Erich Fromm was a critical theorist who actually was interested. He was a psychoanalyst. He was interested in reality and tethering this. And his big criticism is that the critical theorists had sort of fallen off the cliff with their theories that were completely detached from reality, and that he did believe in biology, and he was basically kind of excommunicated. Like, he was not part of the group, not just for that reason, but apparently they had some real estate deals together. So
the only discipline with an objective reality is curriculum studies.
That's right. That's right. So, in terms of the math, look, the fact is that there has always been cultural exchange across the Eurasian continent. So, math developed because of contributions going from China to India to Greece and Rome, kept alive during the Islamic conquest because of the original Greek and Roman settlements in North Africa. I mean, you can't say that math is white when you're talking about an entire continent. I mean, I'm not even sure what white means. Like, outside of the context of how Black Americans view the outgroup. I mean, is someone from Nagorno-Karabakh white? Are they white in the same way as someone from Iceland? What about someone from Sicily? Like, certainly if you speak to an Italian or a Greek person, just like Jews, they will say, I'm not white. Like, the manja cakes are white. I'm not white.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure when they talk about white, who they're talking about.
Well, they were, I mean, and I think you mentioned this in your article, I mean, that perhaps some of this works, if we're going to give their theories legitimacy here, if you're dealing with some sort of binary of white Americans and Black Americans, which was, marginalizing the Mexicans and the Native Americans for a second here, which was the reality of this country in the middle of the 19th century, right? But then once you get this big wave of immigration coming after the 1880s, this entire theory completely breaks down, or maybe it continues to work for Blacks and whites, but it excludes all these other Americans. And then it certainly does not work when you export it to Europe. I mean, it completely breaks down there, because in Europe, things are conceived we sort of think of as race here. They think of ethnicity as over there. And I learned this
Yes.
studying the Soviet Union. And that's how they don't have this homogenous conception of white unless they go out and colonize the rest of the world. So maybe Britain in certain contexts it'll work. But once you get to Eastern Europe, this theory makes no sense whatsoever.
No. Well, and in Canada also. I mean, the fact is that the majority of our African heritage population is here because in the 1960s Canada adopted colorblind immigration policies.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's funny that that opened the door for immigrants to come from the Caribbean, from Africa, Black people from the UK, but yet somehow Canada is systemically racist. Well, you wouldn't imagine a systemically racist white supremacist country having a colorblind immigration policy.
And I would argue, and I'll get called a racist for saying this, that African or Black immigrants who came here, beginning with waves like that, have far more in common with immigrants from other parts of the world than they do with descendants from African slaves, if we're talking about the United States here. Because their historical context is entirely different. And the only thing they have in common here, well, not the only thing, but the main thing they have in common here is skin color. But history and the experience of immigration and the experience of setting up new roots as an immigrant is far more akin to the peoples who came over after 1880s and well into the end of the 20th century and beyond here. So we're talking about not just Jews and Italians, but also people from the Middle East and people from East Asia and South Asia. Now, of course, obviously skin color plays a role once you start bringing, cops pulling over people on the side of the road and any sort of racism that's based on skin color, but that's not the only thing that defines life in this country.
Well, and I was going to say is that one of the issues with, sort of talking about systemic racism and white supremacy is that you have to talk about, well, what system are you talking about? Certainly there's an argument to be made that in certain, for example, police cultures, and again, we should investigate what are the reasons for it, that, there may be an anti-Black animus that accounts for, as per their percentages in the population, more of them being pulled over unreasonably. But again, like these things need to be studied. If we want to solve problems, we have to define them and we have to look at the evidence and we have to, be open to all investigation. The problem with contemporary critical, the problem with contemporary critical theory is we say, okay, well, you've got an unequal outcome, right? So more, Black people are stopped by the police than, other groups. Therefore, it must be racism. Well, that's a possibility. It could be racism, but we should be curious enough to look at other reasons. And there's lots of Black thinkers that say the same thing. I mean, John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry. I mean, these are the kind of things that they talk about, and they are the ones to talk about it because it's about their community. Like, I don't feel comfortable talking about
Thomas Sowell and Carol Swain are probably the best on it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I look at that and I go, look, I'm not going to go into another, ethnicities community and tell them how to conduct their affairs or what they should work on or what they should change. In the same way, I wouldn't want someone outside the Jewish community coming into my community and telling us how we should conduct our affairs. But, as a society, and both Canada and the United States are multicultural societies, we have to have some agreements about, what our codes of behavior are, as opposed to codes of what you're supposed to think. And the problem with contemporary critical theory is that it wants to be like a religion, that you have to think the way that they say. And that is absolutely improper and at odds with classical liberalism. We can't tell people don't want to be told what to think. We can agree that there are certain behavior standards. We can agree that, society works best if we're civil toward each other, that we, exercise, just general politeness toward each other, that we not judge each other by external factors, that we judge each other by merit. Those are things I think people can agree upon. But, the critical theorists, for example, I mean, merit to them is, again, white supremacy, because, any explanation for differences in outcome other than racism, and now, of course, we've got the new one, which is gender identity, they say that the second you ask those questions, then that makes you racist or it makes you a transphobe.
You can't have
And
any opinion on anything that differs from theirs without being, labeled a racist or a transphobe or a homophobe or a sexist or whatever it might be. You can't oppose gay marriage without being labeled a homophobe, right? You can't possibly have completely other reasons for that position without having any problem with homosexuality, right? So,
well, it's one of the reasons that I don't even like the term anti-Semitism, to be honest with you, because again, these terms are not easily defined. We say, "Oh, I know it when I see it," right? So I can understand, a gay couple. I mean, I have friends that have been in long-term relationships with children, same-sex couples, and they say, I don't want to hear from someone that, gay people shouldn't get married. Like, F off. Like,
Mhm,
it's none of your business.
mhm.
I totally understand that, right? To them, that feels terrible. And they're not interested in engaging in an intellectual conversation about what are the societal reasons for marriage and why do we have that institution. And different people can disagree. Like some people may say it's about procreation. I look at it and I say it's about ensuring that we have community supports for people so that they form an economic unit, that the government doesn't have to worry about them. They take care of each other. Under that model, then anyone should be able to
And I
form
think this
those
does go back to
units.
the Frankfurt School with that book by Adorno, The Authoritarian Personality, right? So he,
Right.
he says that anyone who has any kind of conservative or traditionalist perspective on societal norms is therefore the sort of personality that will lead to Nazism or something very much like.
Oh, I mean, given the way that Stephen's just described these people, they have turned this into a religion, much as the Soviet Union has turned
Yeah.
Marxism into a religion. And once they say, I mean, and it's obviously it's not like the USSR, but once they say that there is no objective reality and all these things are, discursive systems or whatever fancy terms they're using today, then it is a religion, right? It's all based on
Yeah.
belief. It's
Yeah.
100% based on belief if there is no objective reality, because how else
Well,
could
and John McWhorter makes that argument. I mean, he says, it's a religion in all but name.
Well,
And in fact, it's inspired by Christianity. Because if you think about it, first of all, you have to believe, right? Number two, if you are not black, you were born with original sin. So, and you have to spend your whole life in penance, right? In order to get to that utopia, which I guess is like
right,
the messianic
right.
age,
And not only
right?
that,
And
but there's a timeline as well. There's a past, a present, and a future. A messianism, like this is where we're headed. This is the end of days with pure equality, where even
yes,
nature is not going to be able to persecute you anymore.
right. And in fact, and without any plan, right? It's not like they've drawn up extensive plans about how they're going to get there or what this new society is going to look like. Like I always say, because in education, this is a big thing. Like we have to be for transformational change. And my comment is always, well, before I sign up for change, I'd like to see a thumbnail sketch of what that is going to look like. And I'd also like to know how you intend to get there. Like, what if someone doesn't want that change? What do you do with them?
Right. Well,
And
Marxism is in that sense, I'm not an expert on Marxism by any means, but it's a utopian religion in the same way because
yeah,
you take a basic document like the Communist Manifesto and it's all laid out nice and scientifically at first with the progression of stages of history, and then boom, you get to this utopia where if you read the last 3 pages where everything's
yeah,
wonderful, and it's well, you don't explain how you get from point, the
right,
second to last point, the penultimate point to the last point, and that's where you have your book of revelations and whatnots of some sort of great
right,
transformative moment with the Messiah coming, whatever it might be for the
yeah.
Marxists. And
Well,
and
and I think that
There's a God in it, right? It's the spirit of history.
yeah, yeah. Well, you're getting it to Hegel now, and I don't know enough about him to really.
But this, Marx borrows that whole concept.
Absolutely,
yes.
yeah.
Well, and that's why I said Marxism also, comes out of the Enlightenment. I mean, the original Frankfurt, theorists, they had no problem with the Enlightenment initially. Look, this happens anytime you're a thinker and you start going down the road, right? Of, I've got this sort of path that I'm thinking about. Eventually, it's going to lead to like some disaster. because, eventually it becomes more and more detached from reality. And that's exactly what they did. Like, you become so focused on this one narrative of oppression that eventually, no, of course, like, so, the world is a terrible place. Like, you end up becoming detached from the reality around you, which is far more complex than, this sort of binary theory. And what's interesting is that, in the contemporary mode, they want to get rid of all binaries, right? Everything's a spectrum except for the binaries that they like. So they like, the binary of racist, anti-racist, and they like the binary of oppressed, oppressor, and they like the binary of like white and then of color, cis and trans.
Yeah.
So the binaries that they like somehow are okay. But
Yet they
what
have
gets
all these boxes, right? You have the option of checking off, 15 boxes, and the more boxes you check off, the better. So that would seem
yeah,
like it would negate the binary, but it really doesn't, because it's still oppressor or oppressed, and you add
I
up the
think
number of
that
boxes you
those
check
things
off.
right.
are
Your intersectionality makes you add up all the boxes that are not white, cis, etc., and then you get a higher score, which now is being used. I mean, less so. I think there's a correction in the United States, but certainly in Canada, is being used to decide whether or not you get research grants, whether or not you get tenure, whether or not you get a job as a professor, whether or not you get a job in government or the university. I mean, lots of jobs are now closed off to pale skinned boys. And I always say, woe to the society that excludes its young boys, flushed with testosterone. We know what happens when those boys are excluded from society. It's not pretty.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
think the things that make them look like they're thinking in binary terms, though, are merely operational. Like they don't want to think in binary terms. What they really envision is a society at the end of days where anyone can pick whatever they want and be whatever they want. And the only way to get there is through some kind of operational binary system.
But you can't choose to be black. Remember, there was that article, right, that was withdrawn from publication, where that philosopher who wanted to argue.
They want you to be able to choose whether or not to be black. These things could be ultimately, like not anytime soon, but at some point down the road, this is where they eventually want us to be, where
I
everything
I
is
think you're giving them too much credit. Like, I don't think that they've thought deeply enough about this,
who's
because think
they?
about it.
I think some of the more
Well, okay,
intellectual among them have.
They're all theys at this point. Haven't we decided that? They've chosen to
that's
be
right.
theys.
No, I think by they I mean the people that are either the critical theorists, the contemporary critical theorists, or the ones that follow the religion. I don't think any of this is well thought out, because think about it. You're allowed to self-identify into any identity category except race, right? So, and it doesn't make sense, because by the same provision that you can identify as the opposite sex and call that a gender identity, then you should be able to also be transracial, right? Like the case of Rachel Dolezal, or the
I think
Pretendian cases in Canada.
I think that there's very much an intellectual contingent among them that has thought these through, but they also have very good people that are very good with politics. The woke left is very good with politics. They're very good with getting what they want and achieving their goals.
I'd like to know who the thinkers are. I'm yet to like these deep thinkers that you think have thought through these issues. I'm
Well,
not
They're
acquainted
not in
with them.
Jewish studies. I will tell you that much.
but I mean, you could read
I'm not
about
sure they're anywhere. Where are they? Who are they?
I'm not necessarily saying that they're good thinkers. They're terrible thinkers. Like everything they're saying is rotten. But I do think that there is some kind of theoretical vision that I just described.
I don't think so. I think that, I mean, they'd be lucky to have you to maybe create a theoretical vision for them. I don't see that in any of their writing. I mean, their writing tends to be producing the same article over and over, and just scrambling the word salad with different words. Every so often they'll have a new redefinition or a new sort of thing. Like the latest one is decolonizing the mind, right? And so my question is always like, short of a brain injury, How do you remove something from your long-term memory? Like you can't, other than brain injury or disease. So how are you decolonizing your mind or decolonizing altogether? Right? Like what is, no one wants to define, like you think that they have a theoretical, sort of strategic plan. They don't even want to define these terms in any operational way because what does that mean? Are these people going to leave their $1 million homes in North America and go back to some ancestral land? Um, or are they just talking about, like I asked this question, in education, they right now decolonization is a big deal. And I say, well, you want to decolonize, like, do you want to stop speaking English? Do you want to like get rid of the university? Are you willing to work for free? Like, what do you mean by decolonizing? Are you going to give up your home?
Yeah, but
Like, what
again,
does that mean?
Yeah, but see, Adam, just along these lines, to go back to our concrete example here, mathematics is a tool of white supremacy, which presumably, in light of everything you said, means that this was a tool that, in practice, whatever its origins, though I think they would agree the origins are there too, is used to keep people of color and whoever else down, right? Because it's premised on.
but I think these things are operational. Like I don't even think you need a very complex explanation for where they want to go. I mean, it's all based on something very simple. It's
No,
the,
but what
the
are they going to replace the math
I'm
with? Adam,
explaining.
what are they going to replace the math with? If
It's the
mathematics is a tool of white supremacy.
It's the Marxist model, right? Where they've adjusted it, they've retooled the Marxist model so that it's no longer about worker and capitalist anymore. It's now about that we're not going to have any oppression. It's not going to derive even from nature anymore. And the problem with science is that science is oppressive. Science tells you that you are a male because of your genitalia. You are a female because of your genitalia. They want to reject science because it's oppressive and putting you into that binary box. I think ultimately what they want to do is get rid of all oppression.
Yeah, but there's
Yes,
no model for it. They don't have any model for
discursively.
what'll happen. What'll it look
That's
like?
right.
It doesn't
That's right.
exist.
That's right. I disagree with you, Adam, that I don't think it's operationalizable. And that's the one thing that I always do when I'm speaking with them, or if we're having a discussion or a debate, is to say, operationalize that for me. Like, show me what I'm going to do. I'll give you an example. They often talk about the anti-racists, well, you got to do the work. You got to do the work. And so I say, okay, Monday morning, my alarm goes off. I get up, I shower, I have my coffee, I'm ready to start my day. I've got, 8 hours between 9 and 5. What work am I doing?
I'm
Right?
not.
And then it falls apart because they don't actually have a plan for what work you're doing. It's just words. And
I'm
even
not.
about the oppression. Well, let me just finish. Even about the oppression, like, yes, okay, there's oppression, but the fact is they don't want to get rid of oppression because they have to conserve oppression because if there's no oppression, then they have no job. They have nothing to do. Right. So they don't actually want to get rid of oppression. And if they did want to get rid of oppression, they would be interested in finding out why are these people oppressed? Why is this group not doing as well? And I should say, they frame it like not doing as well, period. But that's not true. It's not doing as well in a particular area. In other areas, whatever, African Americans, for example, excel. And that's aside from the fact that there are great African American thinkers and scholars and scientists and whatever, but in many other areas they excel and their numbers are far beyond their numbers in the population. Why do we say that this area, whatever, education is the most important and more important than other areas? It's not true. I mean, all these areas are important. And different groups sometimes excel for all sorts of reasons in different areas. Why is that a bad thing? I mean, do we want to have a homogeneous society where everyone excels at everything? I'm not sure that that's possible. And they're not interested in the reasons, nor are they interested in improving anything, right? Like we know, for example, that if once you take out the factor of socioeconomic background, right? So there you're talking about your family income, whether or not it's a two-parent family, the culture within the family. Once you take that out, the scores mostly equalize, right? So someone who happens to be Black, who comes from a well-to-do family, has a lot more in common with well-to-do South Asians, well-to-do Europeans, whatever, than they do with someone from a low socioeconomic level, and that shows itself in its outcomes. These people are not interested in fixing that, and those things are fixable. Certainly in education, we have a whole science of learning that they've done 7-year long longitudinal experiments in Scotland and found that just by doing things according to the evidence of how children learn, that even kids from low socioeconomic homes 7 years later are, for example, reading 3.5 years of their peers ahead of their peers. So I disagree with you. I don't think that they were operationalizing any of this. And I think they don't have a single vision for the future beyond just that, pat term transformational change.
Yeah,
I've
Adam,
never heard them described.
I
hold
really,
on, hold on. Yeah, I'm getting in a word here. Hold on, Adam.
I need to respond to this.
Okay, go ahead. But then I want my response. Go on.
I think you're reading too much into what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they're any good, right? They're nitwits, and I'm not saying that there's any consistency in what they're doing and thinking through. And there's all kinds of contradictions that come into play between their own professional benefits, what they stand to gain personally, versus their long-term thinking about what is going to make for a more just human society. They stink. They're really bad at it. But I do think there is something at play.
Yeah, but Adam, I think hold on. I think if they do have a conclusion in mind, and I think you could look to how they express DEI at this point, they're not interested in eliminating all these boxes so anyone could be anyone. They want to preserve these boxes that could be checked off. They want everyone to be in their boxes.
They believe that for the time being.
No. This is how DEI is different from affirmative action. They want equity. They want the people who are, according to their formula, oppressed to be able to rise to the top, and perhaps the oppressors will be put on the bottom, perhaps. But they want those boxes preserved to check off. They want to fetishize these differences, these boxes that people check off, and that'll determine their place in society. So that for them will be an equitable society. They don't want to eliminate these boxes. They have no interest in it.
I think it depends upon who they are, but I think that that a lot of them do want these kinds of things for the time being. That eventually we can get rid of these things and dismantle it.
I've never heard any contemporary critical theorist. I mean, I think that you would be doing them a favor if maybe you wrote an article on critical theory, about operationalizing it. But that's not it. That's not in the literature.
Every time I talk to them, that is their response, that we have to do these things now.
Okay, well, now I'm asking you, who's the they? Who are you talking to?
Well, I'm not going to tell you specific individual names on this podcast, but I have conversations with I'm not going to say thinkers, with scholars on the left.
Well, I'd be very curious.
Conversations for years with them.
You've just demeaned the term scholars by saying you won't use the term thinkers, but let's leave that.
I'd be very curious. I'd be very curious about what kind of timelines they like. The other thing is that generally, if you want to have a policy change, right, you have to have some way of measuring whether or not this policy change is working, right? So that you can be accountable. And that's the other thing that's missing. So these people, they might say, and again, I don't see it in the literature, so maybe this is their personal opinion. They might say, oh, this is just for the time being or whatever. But for how long? How long do they envision that this is going to have to go? What is the measure at which point we no longer have to have the boxes? Like, that's what I mean. Operationalizing it, like making it, tethering it to reality, is not their specialty. And, the repressive tolerance comes from Marcuse. I mean, Marcuse is the one who said that we can oppress the dominant, power brokers in society and their progeny, right? Their children who had nothing to do with any of it other than the misfortune of being born to their parents, that we can oppress them because we want to give the voice and the power to the marginalized. And, again, who they define as marginalized.
There is also a parallel here with the USSR. Once their revolution never came into effect and they achieved that state they called late socialism, where they preserved all their categories and all their boxes, and it was just so close to, you know, the fruition of communism, but it never actually came, perhaps because there was no world revolution, or perhaps, you know, behind closed doors they realized, okay, this isn't going to work out, and, you know, we keep it this way, we'll be able to preserve our power. It's a similar idea here, right? I mean, there might be some sort of utopia down the road that's not thought out, and at the end of the day, I question whether they really have, as you suggested, Stephen, whether they have any interest in actually achieving this.
Well, and I think that they also, you know, the biggest problem with it is that it ignores human nature, and not just human nature, but all life on Earth. I mean, all life on Earth is on a quest to, you know, take as much resources as possible until it's stopped by another organism. And it doesn't matter if you're a human taking land or whatever until someone stops you, or whether you're a slime mold. Um, all organisms on Earth, plants, right? When we talk about, you know, plants has taken over the garden, this is part of the nature of life on Earth.
And you'll be called a
So
social Darwinist for saying this, right?
I
So now, we
suppose
now
so,
have a
but
homophobe, a racist, and a social Darwinist on our
that's
podcast.
right.
It'll be our title.
No, but you know, the fact of the matter is that we, you know, if we want to make policies that make life better for people, then we can't ignore the reality. We have to say, okay, well, if this is part of human nature, then what can we do to soften its edges? Right? And that's the mistake. They think you can remake the human. You can't remake the human. You can soften the human's edges, which is what I think constitutional democracy does, the rule of law, you know, those things, civility, those are the things that are made to soften our edges so that we can get along better and have a state of what we would consider to be, you know, in parlance, equity, not in the way that they use it, but equity in the sense of that, a fairness in general.
But human nature is an enlightenment concept, right? What I think the real problem is that there's no willingness to think about the broad concept of human happiness or justice, these big questions like that. Um, you know, when I teach ancient political thought, and in that class, you know, I try to get my students to think about what justice is, what human happiness is, what the good life is, and they're not willing to even entertain the possibility that there's even an answer to that question, right? All we have are, you know, relativistic
Right.
right. That's all they're willing to. But at the same time, they're out there protesting for something, right?
For
Well,
justice.
then that's your idea of justice. That to you is the good life, whatever it is you're out there protesting for.
Well, listen, you know, I look at it, you know, first of all, I disagree with you that it's just from the Enlightenment. I mean, certainly, you know, you can go back to the Torah and, you know, the Torah makes lots of assumptions about human nature and, you know, it's the original, let's soften the edges. And I say that as someone who's an atheist, but, you know, I think there's a lot to look at. I think in lots of religious traditions, not just in Judaism. Um, you know, that the point of it is to say, you know, this is human nature, however we define that, and here's how we're going to manage that
I
so
agree.
that we get along.
I agree with you. I agree with you entirely on that. But the concept of nature is from the Enlightenment. It's a scientific way of
Yes,
understanding these things.
yes. You know, justice. Like I always say, I'm also I'm a lawyer. I was trained as a lawyer. I practiced for 22 years. Um, you know, I think people have a fundamental misunderstanding of justice. Like justice, you know, people don't have rights. People have rights claims. And you make a claim and you say, I have the right to X, right? And that's fine until you hit someone else's rights claim that they say, I have a right to X. And then ultimately, you have two choices. Either you're going to negotiate where, you know, demarcate your rights, or you're going to have to go to a higher authority who then, you know, through a tradition developed through the, you know, through uh, various cultures, has then said, we are now going to decide where that line is. So, you know, is that justice? I mean, I guess so, but some people might think, well, I didn't get exactly what I wanted, so I didn't get justice. So maybe justice is a relativistic term. I mean, I'm not sure that there's an objective justice other than to say that the process itself leads to justice because a decision is finally made demarcating people's rights claims. What do you think, Brad?
I mean, I think there is a justice, a singular, absolute justice. I borrow money from you. You don't. I don't return it to you. That's unjust, right? Like we could point to things that we know.
Well, what if you don't return it to me now? I'm very wealthy, you're poor, your family has just been killed in a fire. All the cash you were storing to repay
I
me
mean,
was
these are the
burnt.
kind of things that
I do,
Socrates brings up.
but these are the kinds of things that then, I I don't know. Is it just or not? Would it be just? Some people might look at this and say, well, it's not just if you owe me money, you're, poverty stricken. I'm so rich that I won't even notice the money, but you won't be able to eat. Is
Natural
it
law,
just?
or whatever you want to call it, absolute justice requires a lot of conversation, right? I the way I put it to you is very simplistic, but I mean,
Yes,
to look at like the Talmudic debates, right, that happen in say the Gemara, where they argue over the appropriate right thing to do in any given situation. Obviously, it requires a lot of details and circumstance, right? So, but
and
all
disagreement.
kind of in disagreement. Ultimately, there's some kind of principle being applied, and I think that principles do exist, and therefore we can conceptualize some kind of universal justice.
Okay, I
All right,
maybe
just
we'll agree to disagree.
All
since you
right.
brought up the Gemara, I will make a plug for my book, the
Yes,
Seinfeld Talmud again here, because they do weigh into some of these heavy debates involving justice in the Seinfeld context. I mean, George Costanza was always after restitution. In one of the episodes, I believe it was the one with the step skipper, and he ended up in anger management after that, or Rageaholics Anonymous, I think it was. So I think I keep modifying the title of this episode based on the course of the discussion, but I have it still as critical theory, social justice, which I just added to it, and the colonization of education after October 7th. So we do
ah,
need to actually talk about
yes,
Jews, which is somehow we managed to really avoid doing for the past hour, remarkably. And as I teach my classes, when I teach the Enlightenment, when I teach World War I always give the framework, and then I say, okay, so what does this have to do with the Jews? And I'd like your thoughts on this, Stephen, about what all this stuff that you've laid out here has to do with the Jews and Israel, of course, but the Jews, in general, and how this has, I would say, gone into overdrive since October 7th in many respects.
sure. So I think there's two aspects to this. One is how we experience this as Jews, and the other is how this system looks at Jews from the outside. So let's do the outside first. So in this model, you have to remember that you're put into this binary. You're either the oppressor or the oppressed. It's based basically on an American narrative of the Black experience, around the civil rights movement. So, any developments since then are less relevant than they are around then. So, again, under that model, Jews are not part of the Black in group. Jews must be part of the out group. And the other thing that is looked at as oppressors is really, and this has been sort of added on as this idea of white adjacency, and that is any successful minority. So South Asians, East Asians are also looked at as white adjacent. They are oppressors. So the Jews are lumped in that. So now the Jews are white.
Except
So
those have the other peoples have dark skin color going for them, right? Because skin color is very relevant in their classification system.
well, it's interesting because the critical theorists will tell you, yes, it's very important, and at the same time, no, it's not important because white supremacy is a concept, not based on your skin color, and you don't know what you're talking about. So they talk out of both sides of their mouths.
Right.
They'll say, oh, the skin color is important, and we have to worry about East Asian racism, but at the same time, no, it's about a way of thinking, and East Asians have basically they have wanted to become white and therefore they're white adjacent. So I mean, there's always a way to ultimately take any
Well, that's at the root of
group.
Chinese civilization. That's what Confucius was writing about. How can we become white adjacent?
That's right, exactly. I mean, for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Same with Hindu thought. Has been preoccupied with how we become white. I mean, that's what I mean. It's the flattening. It's the unintelligent
Confucius asked, Jesus was
flattening.
Palestinian. How do we
Right.
how do we oppress him?
Exactly. So if you're white now and you're an oppressor, then there's other things that come. You're also a colonizer, right? So wherever you are, you're a colonizer. You can't be indigenous because again, there's the binary. You're either indigenous or you're a colonizer. So now you're a colonizer. And then I think it picks up on some of the, old tropes that have always animated anti-Semitism, that Jews are the worst example of the things that we hate most in society. So if we hate white supremacy, Jews are the worst example because they only care about themselves and their money, and they're now with Israel, they're colonizers and whatever. So like there's no hope there. Now, from the Jewish perspective, DEI poses a real problem. That's diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's actually antithetical to Jewish tradition and Jewish thought. So if we go through them, equity means equality of outcomes. Jews don't like equality of outcomes. Jews say that you do the hard work, and if you are excelling or succeeding, we celebrate that. We don't cut people off at the knees, which is why Israel became the country that it became. Granted that all the countries in the Middle East were granted independence around the same time in the late 40s or sometime in the 40s and whatever. And you look at Jordan, you look at Lebanon, you look at Iraq or whatever, where they're at, you look at Israel, right? Well, Israel is an exceptional country because it doesn't cut people off at the knees. You've got a good idea, and and this whole idea that you're going to improve the human condition. Well, we support that. So Jewish thought is against equity. Diversity is not doesn't mean diverse voices, diverse people. Diversity really means that we take all the marginalized people. We have to have as many marginalized people in power as possible. That's what diversity means. Judaism doesn't make those distinctions on the basis of race or etc. I mean, we make our distinctions on the basis of tradition and liturgy, tradition, those kinds of things. Of course, based on geography to some degree, but because Jews have wandered until the return to Israel, that's all over the place. I mean,
Let me just interrupt about one thing here. This is what a lot of scholars in Jewish studies are trying to do at the moment. I won't call them thinkers. I'll just call them scholars. They are writing these ahistorical texts about, race and Jewish history and things like that. They're, not only projecting onto the past, but they're also projecting onto the present in many respects because they want it to fit this overall narrative.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for a more, I guess, mundane or I don't know what the right word is, but they want to be accepted into the social justice club. So this is what they have to be written about. They want they're curious in that respect. So, so they are doing this, and it is affecting their scholarship.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a fake scholarship. I mean, it's that's not part of the Jewish tradition. You will not find these racial categories that are a product of European thinking. Maybe the 17th century is where it started, and then really reified in the United States. To this very day, it's just not part. I mean, we've got a 5,000-year-old culture, right? Now, this culture recognizes that that Jews spread out and that the Jews have different traditions or whatever. But what has been the response when you look at, for example, Israel as the ingathering of the exiles? The response has not been to keep people in their boxes. The response has been intermarriage and basically, the cultivation of a new pan-Jewish Israeli identity that, I mean, for the current generation, I mean, very few people would say that they're Ashkenazi, except in trying to explain where their parents or grandparents came from. And so many Israelis are a mixture of this, that, and the other thing. Now we're at the point where people may be a mixture of 8 different backgrounds.
And you know what? I will say that I've seen Chabad has been more open to African American people than conservatives or anyone else. I mean, yeah, okay, fine. There are boundaries.
Absolutely.
You have to be Jewish, but once you're authentically Jewish by Chabad standards, doesn't matter what color you are. They don't care.
Absolutely. And I find that, I'm a musical director in a shul here in Toronto. And while I don't attend regularly, I mean, there are people of all different backgrounds. They welcome in people that convert to Judaism. It doesn't matter what they look like. And even that shul is sort of abandoned, saying that we follow Ashkenazi rites, that, we do a little bit of everything. We borrow from everything. And you see that in Israel, like that Sigt has become a holiday around Sukkot, and that Mamuna is a holiday after Pesach, which comes from the Moroccan tradition. I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? It doesn't divide itself into races. And when I hear Jewish scholars in particular saying that there are white Jews and black Jews and brown Jews, I mean, all they're trying to do is they're trying to water down the Jewish tradition because their real affinity is to the religion of critical theory. And they're trying to slot the Jews into there for myriad reasons.
And this,
And
offending me as a historian as well, they'll go back to the Tanakh or the Talmud, and they'll find the use of the word, let's say, Kushite, Kush, which refers to even anachronistic
yes,
black people, used in a derogatory manner in that context, or not even in a derogatory manner in that context.
it was
Oh, it's
historical
derogatory
terms.
today. Well, then they had to have been racist against black people in the Torah.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely, it's absolutely ahistorical. And that's, again, that comes down to the problem in critical theory, that they're not interested in evidence. Like, history is complicated, and history, to be a good historian, you have to be interested in looking at the evidence and looking at all the evidence to then construct a narrative that is founded on that evidence. If you're constructing narratives based on something in your own mind or something that you heard at a social justice seminar, well, that's not scholarship. I mean, that's cult, promotion.
I will
And
say
I
in
think,
defense of my discipline that a lot of these people who are writing this stuff are trained in religious studies. They're not actually trained in history.
well, so that's interesting too, because you would think that if you're trained in religious studies, then you would also be, your evidence would be the texts and the book, not your imaginings and what, Bell Hooks wrote, or Louis Farrakhan, which, a lot of the current, the putting people in boxes and that racism is never going to end and all that stuff, that, I mean, that's from the Black separatist movements. I don't understand what that's doing in Jewish studies, and I don't understand the criticism of Israel. When you say to them, look, you can use the decolonization theory and say that, Israelis, Jews were settler colonialists, which is ridiculous when you actually think of, the people that were running away after the Holocaust or after being forced out of Arab countries, as refugees, that somehow they were like, coming from the metropole to establish, some colony to take all their resources where they had no connection. Ridiculous, but not for 1 second are they willing to entertain that maybe, the creation of Israel was the world's grandest decolonization movement, where all the colonists since the Jews were forced to contend with the fact that the indigenous people were returning to their land and prepared to live in peace alongside the people who were already there. So, I find it very interesting that they're not willing to consider that. But again, they're not willing to consider it because in critical theory, the Jews cannot be oppressed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter that they'll say, oh, the Holocaust was, a long time ago. Somehow slavery was very recent, but the Holocaust was a long time ago.
Yeah, no, it's
And,
absurd. Now,
and I think
sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Why do either of you have any problem with this?
Why do we have a problem with this?
Yeah, why do you have a problem with it? There's no justice, so why do you have a problem?
Well, because it's demeaning academia. It makes people racist against
So,
Jews. I don't think I understand
they
your.
can do whatever they want. Unless you
well,
say that
okay.
the only problem with it is that it goes against your interests.
It
Yes.
goes against the interests of the Jewish people. I don't want to see Jews bullied on
That to me is
college campuses.
Yeah.
insufficient.
What?
No, well, he says it's insufficient, but I mean, I agree with Jarrod. I think that, look, this is going to have what's going on here in the diaspora. No one cares in Israel, really. And you know what? If America turns against Israel, they'll find other allies, and they'll happily, ally with China and Russia and India and whoever else they need to ally with for the survival of Israel. If that ends up being the case, but the fact of the matter is who's it really impacting? It's impacting diaspora Jewry. I
Yeah.
mean, lots of people are feeling threatened. The younger generation, I have a friend. He's the head of Jewish studies at York University, Kalman Weiser, and he says no one raises their child Jewish unless they have to. And I think there's something in that, right? That you do it because it's so important to you and so much a part of who you are that you care about the continuation of the Jewish people, and you care about the continuation of the Jewish people in the diaspora. And I think that more and more people are giving up and not caring and saying, it'd be easier not to be Jewish if that's the case, and if it's going to it's going to be harder for my kid to get a job, and they're going to suffer at university or whatever. Is it that important? They're not literate in it anymore. I mean, again, our education standards have gone down. So lots of people who go to Jewish day schools can't speak Hebrew. They don't really know Tanakh. They don't know much about Jewish culture. They get sort of like the summer camp version of Jewish education.
But then they'll just be
And
regular white people and they'll come for them anyway. I mean, it's
yeah,
not,
yeah,
or
yeah,
they'll be
yeah.
still marked as Jews, even though they'll say, you know what, I want out. I mean, we know that it doesn't work that way. You can't opt
Well,
for being Jewish. It
that's
doesn't
right.
work that way.
Well, and that's the risk ultimately. And it's interesting because since October 7th, I've seen lots of sort of like, you know, Jews fall out of the closet that I didn't even know were Jewish, like that suddenly feel like, oh my God, like, I have a sense of peoplehood with all these other people. And, I have to say that one of the benefits in the diaspora of October 7th is the rise in anti-Semitism has caused the Jews to wake up and to say, you know, like being Jewish and having a Jewish community that is strong and proud or whatever, like people are rediscovering their backbone. And I think a lot of Jews are starting to say, you know what? DEI seems to be anti-Jewish. I don't buy into it anymore. And I don't like, this exclusion. And I think that this is all hypocritical. I think some of that is happening. And we know that, in the diaspora, historically, the Jews have flourished during times of anti-Semitism, and sometimes have not done so well, during times where they were more accepted into society. Granted, there was less of a physical risk, but there was the risk of assimilation. So I think that really what has gone on since October 7th is a little bit irrelevant in terms of Israeli Jews and Israel in general, but I think it's really deeply affected diaspora Jewry. And I think that, perhaps it's woken up people. I certainly see that in my circles who are now questioning the whole thing, whereas before they were afraid to stand up and say, what is this social justice thing? Does this make sense? And now people are saying, because of self-interest, this doesn't make sense, and this is actually dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And it's in many respects, diaspora Jews again are paying the price for this anti-Israel activism. And you've suggested this, and I've said this before, that their intent is to intimidate diaspora Jews. Whether the purpose of intimidating diaspora Jews is ultimately to liquidate Israel or not, that I'm not so sure about. But they realize the ticket for that is that diaspora Jews are ultimately vulnerable. It's not like we're walking around with 1,000 self-defense forces or anything like that. And they're also working with stereotypes of a Jewish passivity and whatnot. And they realize that constantly pushing through these BDS resolutions, even though they know they're going to fail, is a way of just making Jews on campus feel uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
Putting up anti-Zionist symbols and slogans that will affect a Jewish student walking by, will make them feel uncomfortable, will force them to hide their Star of David, will force them to take their mezuzah down from their dorm. And I have heard students say this. This is ultimately what they are trying to do as a strategy.
Yes. Yes, I think very much so. And
now they have the intellectual backing. They have the backing from professors with Jewish studies going along with it. Right?
Yes.
With not standing up to it, and in some cases actively abetting it.
Well, the irony, though, is that the ultimate result may be is to force for Jews to go. You know what? I'm going to make Aliyah and go to Israel. I mean, certainly we see that in Europe. I think Europe has been the canary. And it's funny that we didn't realize, like, there's a red-green alliance here. And by green, I mean the Islamists. And by red, I mean the critical theorists.
Hmm.
And, it's
I
a
call it the woke Hamas
strange,
alliance. I call it the
or
woke.
the woke Hamas alliance. I mean, it's weird bedfellows, right? Because, and I'll give you an example. I will attend various school boards will have, sort of learnings or co-learnings on, various phobias. So I went to one that was about Islamophobia, and it was held by the DEI department, which was making big hay about gender identity and sexual diversity. And then, so they had three imams come to talk about Islamophobia. And what do you think their Islamophobia was about? That they didn't want sex ed in school and that they didn't want any discussion of gender identity. And on top of that, they wanted the cafeteria to be converted into a mosque on Fridays. They wanted to have the authority to police, so that girls who were menstruating were not allowed in, and that they thought that there should be an imam that comes to the school once a month to do dawah, which they explained as, being able to explain to people about Islam so that people would, understand Islam more. So, I wonder, the agenda of, the gender identity agenda and the Islamic agenda, at some point they're going to clash.
But what was the response from the critical theorists to these people propagating their
Well,
Islamicization views?
I imagine their heads exploding, like while these people were talking. And then afterward, they say, "Well, thank you so much. It's always great to get these perspectives. Ultimately, we're all allies." Like, it's the cover up. It's just the language, because
There was
again, it's not
there was
based in any reality.
there was an incident in Canada several months ago, maybe even been longer ago, at a school where there was a Pride Day and an Islamic student stayed home. I guess his parents didn't want him attending, and the teacher scolded him. It's all caught on tape,
Hmm.
telling him that you can't be Canadian unless you believe in equality for all people, including the right of gays to get married or whatever.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, look, I have learned a lot being in my program now and talking, with Muslims, with Catholics, with people who, have all sorts of different views around sex ed and all of this. And I've come to, because I'm the type that I couldn't care less. Like, if you wanted to teach my kid about analingus in grade 3, fine with me. Like, I don't have those hangups. But I recognize that I'm probably in the minority and that there's a lot of parents who feel very uncomfortable about this stuff. And what I came to realize is that, they also have a stake, for example, in the public education system, and that maybe there's a way that we can decide what is essential information that belongs in schools as opposed to private conversations in a doctor's office, that we can formulate that no one is going to be offended. So I'm not sure that saying that everybody has to accept this, that, or the other thing is necessarily something that needs to be done at school. Now, if there's a kid who's gay in school, or there's a teacher who's gay or whatever, then absolutely civility would say these are human beings. They are all to be treated with dignity. And whatever your opinions are about their lifestyle, your own opinions, and keep them, keep your mouth shut, because we don't run around, mouthing off to people about how we feel about how they live. It's none of your business. So that's I think, a much better way than trying to indoctrinate kids and say you must think this way or that way. And that's the trouble, getting back to Jews, that we run into, because then we have, teachers saying, well, the Zionists are evil and the Zionists are oppressing everybody, and the poor Palestinian children are being oppressed by the Zionists. Why would kids who know nothing think any differently? I mean, I heard the most ridiculous thing in an Islamophobia seminar. Someone was giving it. This is the Ontario College of Teachers. And someone's giving it, and he goes, okay, so the grade 3 students get a project on a hero that you have. And so one of the girls in the class does a project on Malala Yousafzai. And, project. She went to Wikipedia and she made a slideshow. So the project consists of that. She says, Malala, advocated for girls' education, and in Pakistan, girls can't go to school. And so the guy leading the seminar says, is that Islamophobic?
Go on, you froze there for a second, Stephen. Okay, sorry. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
The last thing I heard
So
is that Islamophobic?
is that Islamophobic? And the teachers in the room, for the most part, said, yes, that's Islamophobic. And I was like, wait a second. You're going to call an 8-year-old Islamophobic because she doesn't understand the Pakistani educational system? Like, if you thought that the Pakistani educational system was so critical to a grade 3 education, then you should teach it directly. You're the expert, right? You can't expect kids to know about the Pakistani education system. So then the guy backed off a bit. He goes, oh, okay, so maybe she's not Islamophobic, but her parents are. I went, now you're accusing these parents that you don't even know of Islamophobia? I said, this is what we're gonna do now? You don't, we're gonna think people's ignorance or the fact that someone thinks differently than you, and we're gonna call that a phobia or a hatred? I don't buy it.
Well, this is
And
why
I feel
in these revolutionary societies they remove children from their families and send them to the re-education camps.
listen,
Also,
somebody
the left has also redefined these terms, right? So
postmodernism.
Islamophobia or racism or any of these terms no longer mean a feeling that people have. It's now a state of being, right? So it doesn't have to be a fault of that one girl or any one particular person that's Islamophobia. It's still
Because it's systemic.
It's systemic. It exists.
Right. Even though you'd be hard pressed to find a system.
Right.
My response to them was, look, as educators, you should know that your job is to be the teacher, right? If all show projects, then we don't need you anymore. You're a big expense to society. Kids can do their own, they can read Wikipedia at home and do their own project on whatever the hell they want to do or not do it because it doesn't matter. You don't even give them
on Wikipedia, by the way.
What?
For me?
Lots of great stuff on Wikipedia. You can
Absolutely.
information on Wikipedia to the very end.
Absolutely. But here's the difference. You're an adult, right? You have background knowledge to navigate Wikipedia. An 8-year-old doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Adam and I have been banned from Wikipedia for trying to insert a very critical paragraph of Omer Bartov in there, explaining why he deserved the Schmagegi of the Year award, and they've come after us. We do have an episode on that either has been posted or will be posted after this one, coming up very soon.
I was following that on Facebook. It was very funny.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Omer Bartov, for sending your minions after us. On that note, we've probably gone on probably an hour and 15 minutes or so. So we should probably this has been a very in-depth and enlightening episode. And I do hope that our viewers have stuck around and watched the entire thing. Stephen, you've offered a wealth of information. You've unpacked it.
Oh, don't say unpack. That's Peggy McIntosh, the critical theorist who talked about unpacking her white supremacy from her knapsack. I say if you don't like critical theory and you don't want it to take over the world, stop using the religious terms. Don't unpack, even though it's, kudos to her for coming up with it.
That word was being used in graduate school in the 90s. I mean, we don't have,
that was when she wrote it in the 90s.
But everyone used it in the history seminars all the time, and we weren't.
I know.
We certainly weren't where we are now then. So
it's blasphemous as a Jew.
It's an academic term. I think I'm a product of the structures within which I live.
That's right. You're subject to the systemic postmodernism that we live with.
Yeah. My positionality is all askew, and there's nothing I can do about it. All right. Well, this is the three of us signing off, and thank you again to Stephen Reich.
Sorry, I want to thank the guest for being on. I agree with our guest about the problem. We disagree as to why it's a problem, but this was all.
You're a conservative and he's not.
That's it. All right, yeah. So thank you very much, Stephen Reich, for appearing on Kvetching with us.
Yeah, and I will say again that Stephen Reich, this is the third episode we currently have in queue at the moment, so this will be the third Reich, not the third right. The third Reich. Yeah.
Well, I'm very honored. Thank you too for having me and allowing me to kvetch.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.